All right. Well, welcome everyone to our episode number 7 of We Can Do Better conversation. And today our topic is on gratitude as we continue our focus on energy and leadership. And Brian and I are actually really excited to have Antoni Travelas and Kimberly Pereira with us on our call today to join us in this chat around gratitude. And gratitude is one of those things that comes up really often in conversation with a lot of people. And we talk a lot about practicing gratitude, having an attitude of gratitude. So we're going to break down some of that today in our conversation and see where it goes. So to kick us off, the question that I have just as a starting point for everyone is, what does practicing gratitude look like for each of you just in daily life? And why is it, like, why do you have that practice in your life?
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and start. Gratitude for me is like a skill, and it's kind of like the muscle that you have to work, because I didn't always have an attitude of gratitude. And so my daily practice started with things where I was probably in my hardest moments, and I was looking for what's the simplest thing that I can be thankful for. And some days that was, I'm really thankful that I have my car. And so I would be in my car and it would be noticing I'm really happy that my car is reliable. And it could be really simple things like that. And so that is part of my daily practice of, in the morning time, it's what am I really feeling thankful for? And it's that full feeling where I can get the sensations in my body of like, oh, I like how that feels. Okay, I'm gonna do more of that. And then like the evening time part of gratitude in my practice is I actually finish my day with my daughters, and we do gratitude. So they begin and they say whatever it is they're thankful for. There's no limit on it. And then I follow up with mine to also share with them what I'm thankful for in my day, and to kind of model also how we can do that. So it starts from darker places and looking for something brighter. That's been my experience.
That's really awesome. And so did you, it sounds like, was there something in your life that kind of, like, is that your why behind it? There was some sort of event that caused you to decide to go that route, or do you have another why around the practice?
Yeah, I think the why for myself and for anybody is we want to feel better.
Okay. Yeah.
And so how do we begin to feel better and be more appreciative of life? And so not just an event, but many events over time. And I guess the why ultimately becomes I want to be able to manage and to have more control over how I feel. And I want to feel a certain way. So what do I have to do to be able to do that?
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah. So for me, it's similar. It starts off in the morning, but the moment I open my eyes, I am grateful. I give that greatness to me just waking up and being able to inspire and impact somebody else in my life, or somebody that I come across, whoever it may be. That feeling of gratitude, it overwhelms me, and I come into the day being energized by it. And so giving that gratitude back to people as I see them every day, it helps me get along with my day. It gives me that momentum. And I'm a firm believer in having learnings in absolutely every situation, whether it be good or bad. And with these learnings comes gratitude, because if you didn't have those learnings, you wouldn't be able to grow. And so there's learnings and behind everything that you do every single day. And so spotting those learnings and being respectful and happy that it happens and being grateful for them just makes the day go by so great, so great. And you know, when you bring it home, I usually bring that home to my family and ask them, you know, what happened today? What made you happy today? And so that reflection point allows them to have that same gratitude.
Right.
Love that, Antoni. And so for me, gratitude was so focused on mindset. And so we get what we're looking for, right? And so for me, it was building a practice of looking at the good and the positive in life, and getting out of my head. Because before I went into my first coaching program, I was probably 99.9%. I'm going to do the Ivory soap example. There's probably 0.1% that wasn't in my head. But so it was building along with meditation. Gratitude helped me focus on the good that was around and in my life, and being grateful for whatever I was grateful for. It could be something simple like having a car like Kimberly talked about, or the breeze coming through the window to greet me in the morning. But you start looking for all things that we just take for granted. Mm. And so it's the practice of greeting the day and just being grateful for the day. And then thinking of, I started off doing a written practice for my gratitude practice, and it's changed now. Sometimes I do it verbally. There are 5 things I'm grateful for each day. And I just did, there was an app I was using at one point, but now I just do it verbally. Writing down 5 things I was grateful for, and it could be a conversation with my mom. It could be whatever that was. But the idea is to focus on the good in life, because there's so much that may not be good or may be stressful in life, and where we may tend to focus. What if I, in this case, could focus on the things I was grateful for? And just like with any other habit you form, 21 days, 30 days, whatever that is, doing it consistently, there's science that proves that this shifts how you look at the world. And so I noticed that happening. Mm-hmm. So that was the invitation. It's focus on, in your day, make it real, make it personal. What are you grateful for? And then, I just started noticing I was doing that more often. Just, it was innately how I was looking at the world, and how we choose to see, and we have a choice, is how we experience life, right? And so that became something that I work with my clients on, in terms of an invitation for them, if they're looking for a practice, is just asking yourself, sort of like what Kimberly and Antoni were talking about. What are you happy about? What are you grateful for? And just making that a consistent practice, whether it's the end of the day, the beginning of the day, during the day, multiple times during the day. There's not one way to do this. It's whatever's right for you.
Right. Beautiful. And that's a really interesting way of doing it, like the idea of choice around it. So for me, the idea of gratitude is similar in that sense, where it's like just being thankful, saying thanks, so I actually recognized that there were times in life that I had to really focus on doing it. Mm-hmm. And I appreciate what you said, Kim, around this idea of feeling it. So for example, I've given this example frequently to people. One of the things that I started to do was pick on the small things to be grateful for. So something like having a cup of coffee, like if it really felt good, like to just actually experience drinking that coffee, and to be grateful for that cup of coffee, it actually does shift. It shifts something for me. And I don't know, I'm not sure that I can explain it in words, but it just feels good to do that. And so I find that it's so natural for us to be drawn to what's not working, mm-hmm. right? To pick up on it, because it'll be really quick. Something can happen right now, and we'll pick up on it right away that wasn't the way it was supposed to be, or that the way that we wanted it to be. But to have that same sensitivity to something really cool that was just as small it's not innate to us until we do something like this. Or like, I need to hone that ability to see things just as fine-tuned that are good in my life, because life is made up of these small pieces, right? So it's not always going to be these amazing big things that happen. Sometimes, or actually, most times, it's just the tiny things like the coffee, the car, the pizza, right? Like the amazing pizza I made. Just things like that is what gets us.
I'm always grateful for pizza and for coffee.
And coffee together, like that's
together.
So what came up for me when you were chatting there too is, and my experience with gratitude has been, it builds my muscle of presence, awareness, noticing, and helps me connect with my state of being so I can shift it if I find I'm not in a place that serves me and serves others, right? So if I'm triggered, if I'm stressed, how do I get back to balance? And so then I might pause, practice, meditate, whatever. So I think the practice of gratitude and looking for what's good, I start to notice when I'm not feeling great, and also when I am, and I'm like, okay, great. Then what's causing this? What's happening right now? And that presence and noticing what's going on helps me replicate it and helps me know a little bit more acutely what it is that's causing this now. So back to the feeling that Kimberly was talking about. And so for me, again, it comes back to seeing differently, but the building of the muscle of awareness, noticing presence, I think helps us be the person we want to be and show up the way we want to show up.
You know, it's funny. Many of us tend to look at only the good things that happen that we should be happy for, that we should be joyful for. But it's in those dark times that we encounter through our past childhood trauma, through bad things that just happen to us every day, that there are blessings in that we need to be grateful for.
I totally agree with you, Antoni. So one of the things in my practice when I work with clients is when they're coming to me because they've had a situation like you're talking about with a childhood trauma, and it's really interfering in their life, and it's a problem for them. And so it's very hard for people to see gratitude or be thankful that something that difficult or that challenging has happened for them. And so part of the, I guess, markers of movement and progress is when somebody has had that kind of an experience and they can really say, you know what, looking back now, it wasn't great. And at the same time, I wouldn't change it because I'm grateful at this point for who I became because of it. Exactly. And that's really like that sign of movement through, right? And so I totally agree when we can come to that place and in those hard moments, look for, like Brian was saying, we start looking for what is going right about this, even though it feels like everything's going completely wrong.
It's all falling apart.
It's all falling apart. And then the opposite, when we bring the gratitude and the other pieces, or is it falling together? And so gratitude, I think, too, to tack on to also what Brian was saying about presence, it allows us to be in the moment without feeling like this is too icky or sticky to have to move away from it. Let me be here and see what there is for me to, like you were saying, to learn, right? What can I learn from this that's actually for my benefit?
Wow.
I love what you're sharing there, Antoni and Kimberly, both around blessing and the learning piece of it. And it's the awareness to be able to notice and invite the thought and the conversation about what is this inviting me to see? Where's this opportunity here that this difficult time or this difficult situation may be trying to direct me or help me see that the next step forward to get me out of it, or invite me to look for hope in a certain way. If it's a traumatic experience or something like that.
And a lot of times it's so difficult to notice. It's right there in front of you. But if you're not present to see it, it just passes you by. And you're like, I don't understand. Why is the world crumbling above me?
Yeah.
I love, and so that's getting us into this mindset of how we have a choice in how we choose to see that. And then I think expands our antennas for being able to notice that. And so, such a rich conversation. Thank you for the learning that you're already creating for me in this conversation.
Well, I loved what you said about falling apart versus falling together, Kim. Like, I don't know that I've thought about it like that before. But as we're talking about this, like one of the things that's coming up that's actually a reality in life is really, really difficult, painful situations that ourselves or people around us go through. And in that moment, to be grateful or to recognize opportunities for gratitude is very challenging. It's almost a blind spot in that moment, not because we're not grateful people, it's just that we can't see it in that moment. So I'm curious to find out from everyone here, have you experienced times in your life where like this practicing of gratitude, you're like, I'm not in a place for this right now?
All the time.
Okay.
all the time.
Yep.
Just like I was saying before, in order for you to find the blessings that are behind every situation, you have to be present. And there's times where I'm not present. There's times where my son, I just want to rip my hair out. And, you know, this morning he was like screaming at the top of his lungs. And so in turn, I was screaming back. And then I stopped to think. I was like, wait a second.
This is not helping.
Obviously screaming because of something. Let's find out why. Until I had a conversation with him, then did I understand exactly what was happening. But it took that moment for me to be present and understand what's happening around me for me to get it. But it's just a matter of practicing it all the time. And I don't think that you could ever get that way unless you are a monk on the high mountain and have no interaction with no other human being.
And you
Even
know, I
then,
think this
it could be, you know,
even then
yeah.
that tree
But
could really upset you that day, and it's all over.
exactly. But I mean, it's all about practicing it. It happens to everyone. You know, even a lot of people ask me, they're like, Antoni, how are you always so energized, always so happy? Guess what? I have my crappy days too. I do. And everyone does. It's just a matter of how you flip it, how you turn it around and make it from something that is so bad to something that can be so great.
Right.
I think it's really important too to acknowledge that emotions are important and they play a role.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would never want to see somebody say, you know, well, just find the silver lining, to somebody who's in a full-on grief or something's happened. And like, people have a right to their difficult emotions. And the whole concept of spiritual bypassing, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, you probably are. And it's really supplanting this positive ideology and this gratitude practice and these spiritual practices, instead of actually facing the source of the difficulty, or really allowing yourself to go through the emotional process to get to the learnings, really is how that works. So I would never want to say, like, move on from your feelings and just focus on being grateful, because it really undermines, right? Like,
No,
it
no,
really
that's
undermines
a
our
great point.
process.
It's a great point. I mean, yeah, telling somebody who's really grieving or going through a really tough time to look for the silver lining is like, that's asking for way too much. I mean, you know, Kim, it's exactly what you said. You know, you have to feel it. We're human. You know, we need to feel emotion. We need to go through these emotions in order to understand what it is that we're actually feeling.
What you're hitting on right there is so important, right? It's like, you know, you're going through something emotional and someone's like, just get over it, right? It's like, how to create this connection in a half a second, right? It's like, what other way could you create this connection faster than doing that and not letting someone experience it and just being there for them,
Mm-hmm.
listening, maybe inviting how you might support them. But that energy is me energy if it's not kind of welcoming and kind of inviting or just being there for them.
Yeah.
So I think the gratitude is also the muscle that builds compassion, right?
Mm-hmm.
In terms of how we can be with self and one another. And so I've noticed, like, in workplaces and other aspects of life, where conditioning is just like, come on, just get over it. We got stuff to do. And it's like, how about we connect with the humans first, pun intended, so that we can kind of help the person through it, let them experience it, let them have the learning. Because we miss out on the learning when we try and fast forward them through the process.
That's a really good point. It's
Yeah.
interesting, as all of you were talking, like, two things were standing out to me in this idea of especially a difficult time and gratitude is the importance of the people around me during that time. Like, who do I have surrounding me during that time, as well as leaning into leaning into the situation or whatever the challenges I'm going through. So as I think about the example you gave, Antoni, with your son, for me, that leaning in was, you're like, okay, so he is having a meltdown here and I'm having a meltdown. So I need to lean into this thing and just have a conversation with him rather than hoping I can outscream him at this time. Win. Like, that's just how this goes.
I can still outscream him.
So, but then the people around us that are really big for that. And so it made me think about, if I'm going through something really dark, who do I have around me that can help me see the possibility of gratitude? Doesn't mean I really do hope they're not going to be like, get over it, Nancy, because that's right. Like, that's a really tough thing to get over, because there's people who are going through some really difficult times. And I'm thinking of someone specific in my life right now. She lost her husband early last year, and this has just been like a tough time for her. And so there was a conversation that was happening around sustainability, like around, how we use our resources, how we use our, like, do we buy too much? When you think about recycling, like, all this conversation was happening. And so someone looked at her and said, like, what did you think of that conversation? She was like, I don't care. And the reason for that is not, and I know that people who don't know her would have been like, oh, she doesn't care about the world. And I'm like, that's not it. Like, she has other things that are top of mind that are taking up her emotional space right now, that seeing that side of it is not possible for her. And so it does make me think about, how do I show up in those spaces to not necessarily override that for her, yet how can I support her so that she's able to see a path through it, this idea of like falling together. But when I think about the loss of somebody, how do you even position that? You know what I mean? Like, just the thought of like, this is something falling together. It's like a really tough place to be. And so in those situations, I can see where the who around us makes a big difference on the ability to even see any sort of light in a situation like that.
It's about having that circle of safety, having the people around you that allow you to feel safe, that will allow yourself the permission to be open and honest and be able to communicate exactly what it is that you feel without feeling judged or hurt or even embarrassed, possibly blame. There's a lot of emotions that come from the feeling of not being safe. And so when you have that circle of safety, like that resonated so much with me, Nancy. It's just, you need to have that circle of safety. And even if you don't, to have somebody like Kim to go to, a therapist, a coach, to be able to walk you through exactly what you're going through. As I said before, we're all humans. We have to go through these emotions because it's just part of who we are.
I love what you guys are talking about, and I have a little secret. Well, actually, it's kind of a big secret that I really want to share with you guys, because listen in.
Tell me.
Because we're all professionals, and beyond that, we're all human. And so, like Brian was saying, that was really, really sticking with me, because what a lot of people don't realize in the research around psychotherapy and therapy in general and coaching, the number one transformative factor of any process is actually the human connection and the presence and the relationship between the professional and the client that allows change to happen. Because it's simply how a coach or a leader or a therapist or whatever, it doesn't matter what role you're in, you're human. And giving that presence and that time and that open space for whatever has to unfold is acceptable. Like, it's that I'm here. It's not about me. It's about you. What do you feel? What do you need? And whatever that is, that's okay, because this is human to human. And everybody has that capacity. And I think it was Brian, you mentioned cultivating compassion. And the research does show gratitude enhances compassion and also empathy. And when I hear about what's happening in workplaces and workspaces, it really is this, we've dehumanized, right? Like,
Totally.
yeah,
Totally.
like even as a professional working in nonprofit as a therapist, it was we're dehumanized. It's like, well, okay, so your next client's coming in. Are you good? Yeah, I know that was traumatic. But the next person's coming, so get yourself together and go. And I know it's crazy, right? It's crazy. And then we wonder why we have burnout. We have all these things. And so it really is like we are all just human to human.
Wow. You know, when you all talked about compassion, the word that was coming up in my mind was self-compassion. And I'm curious to find out from all of you what connection you see between that and gratitude.
Good question.
That's a really good question. I'll let somebody else go first.
So the thing that comes up for me is, are you able to entertain the thought of gratitude if you don't have self-compassion? If you're not compassionate with yourself, judgmental of yourself, I mean, this may even be biological with oxytocin, cortisol kind of stuff. Are you shutting off access to your ability to access gratitude when you're not compassionate with yourself? Conversely, if you have self-compassion, do you have a foundation from which to see, experience, express gratitude, and then be able to start to notice things that are going well? And then also, when things don't go well, do you have the tools then to navigate difficulty when those situations come up? So I think it's sort of a building block, a door opener, if you will, to get to gratitude. And then, also things like hope, right? So how do you get to hope if you can't have compassion for yourself? Because the mindset, what you're able to see, isn't looking in the direction of hope. It's looking in the direction of despair and what's wrong, and those kind of places that are not, they're kind of on the polar opposite of gratitude. So that's sort of what comes up for me with your question, Nancy, around the connection between gratitude and self-compassion.
And I love what you said there too, Brian, because the piece around like compassion literally means noticing a hurt or something that is off for someone and feeling compelled to do something about it. And so anytime I find we put self in front of another word like self-compassion, self-care, self-esteem, we've unfortunately in our culture, there's become this belief that that is selfish. And the backwards learning in all of that is that everything comes from the self first, because we have our own biases and our own filters. And so if we're not working with self first, it actually limits our capacity to do with others or to be with others. And so if we're not able to be with self, we actually haven't built the skill or the muscle to be with others in a way that we would ideally hope or want to. And so you're right about asking kind of the question and to open up the possibility of hope. It does start with the self. It's like, well, what might I want instead of what's happening now? Or what would I like to see that would enhance my life? It doesn't always have to be out of the dark place. It's out of the daily. Maybe you're just bored. Like, like I'm tired of watching the cats go, So, what might I like to experience that's different from now? And, just that possibility opening means that there's room to reopen the access points for good vibes about the self.
Right.
And then carrying that forward with other people. So I love that. Yeah. How do we open it up so that we don't keep those access points closed?
Awesome.
I think for me, when it comes to self-compassion, I want to go back to what I was talking about earlier, and that's about presence. And in order for you to have that self-compassion, you have to be willing to be with yourself, willing to sit with yourself. A lot of times our society is so trained now to either have headphones in, listening to music, watching TV, doing stuff, busy stuff, just so that we don't have to sit with ourselves. And when we don't sit with ourselves, then when those bad things happen, or when those times of hurt or trying times happen, it's hard to be compassionate with yourself. It's hard to just be and sit in the hurt, because guess what? I cry too, right?
Yeah.
And it's because I want to sit in that hurt, and I want to feel the pain in order for me to understand what's happening, so that I can find the learnings and be grateful for those learnings. But without that presence, there's no way for you to find that self-compassion that will lead you to that joy and gratitude.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
It's, Brian, I think it was you mentioned the idea of it being a building block, self-compassion. And so right away for me, that was a visual around like just those blocks of how we build other areas of our life. And so when I think about this idea of self-compassion, it's a starting point, and it's also almost cyclical, right? Like the more you practice it, then you create a greater capacity for it. And that self-compassion creates in us capacity, yes, for ourselves, but it increases our capacity for others, is the way, as you position, Kim. Like all of a sudden my openness to others, whether it's, the place that they're in, whether they make a mistake, they offend me, my capacity increases, because the smaller my capacity for myself, likely my capacity for others in that space is small as well, even though I may think not. But the other thing that stood out for me when it connected to gratitude was that self-compassion piece probably also makes me more willing to receive gratitude. And sometimes it's easy to say, hey, thanks so much, or, I just want to recognize what you did. But that receiving aspect of it becomes this like, oh, I don't know, like, and we push that, we get like really weird about it, like weirded out by kind of receiving it. And that's something like that is telling of something. Like, and I wonder if that is something to do with, like, yeah, I'm actually curious. What does that mean? Like, what does that mean? Our inability to kind of receive it? Does that have something to do with compassion, or what would you guys say?
So I love that, Nancy. And so I believe vulnerability is part of the equation. I think the vulnerability that we are reluctant to step into, unwilling to step into, or don't yet have the capacity to step into, can cause us to kind of be in that place of, and the manifestation is, as you say, uncomfortable receiving gratitude or praise or thank yous or something along those lines. Because vulnerability, that's a lot of what can kind of get in our own way, is our unwillingness to be vulnerable, or fear-based mentality. And the reality, and this was a big shift for me, it's part of my story, is vulnerability is strength. It's what makes us human, right? It's getting back to humanity in the workplace. When we are able to be vulnerable and step into being ourselves, and there's the self-compassion, self-acceptance, then we're able to do that for others. Back to Kim's point, it has to start with self. But when that's there, and it's a spectrum, and it's not like once you got vulnerability, you're good. It's like you got to keep dancing with it.
Check the box, moving on.
I'm good. And so that's why gratitude is like one of those important muscle building things, compassion, acceptance, all these things. When we're able to shift vulnerability and our view of vulnerability to one of strength, one of, hey, it's what makes us human, then we're more apt to reach out and connect, as Kim was pointing us to. And connection is the starting point for almost all of this. And then we're able to be in community with one another and step into that, have compassion, and then be curious. Some of these different things are all sort of part of the space we're in with trying to connect with one another and be grateful for one another. So vulnerability for me is a key component.
Brian, I'm jumping out of my chair because you mentioned like the V word, like the vulnerability is, you're so on, because the fear of vulnerability is actually the fear of presence. If we actually receive gratitude, we have to be present enough to receive it. We have to be present in the moment to allow that to actually come into our field and to take it into our body and to be able to receive that in a full way. We have to be present. And so the vulnerability you're speaking of is, you're so on. It's that fear of what happens if I allow myself to feel in this moment and take that in. Does that mean I'm a certain kind of person, or does that make me weak? Like, do I really need that from other people? There's all these preconceived judgments we have about self if we receive. And you're so right, like leaning into the question of, well, what would happen if I just kind of opened up a little bit to be vulnerable and don't have to expose myself all the way, but what happens if I can just kind of touch that, and how might that change? And that's part of the self-work, is kind of taking the risk to be present, to receive. And then also, you know, we're very good at giving, especially in our professions, right? And that's what we're modeled to do. But in the receiving aspect, in being present, when we do it and we kind of dip our toe in, immediately our body responds, and we can begin feeling the positive benefits that the research on gratitude has really demonstrated. And you're right, the more we exercise that muscle, the more automatic it becomes. And we then begin to feel confident about, oh, I know how to do this. Somebody said, thank you. I can say, you're welcome. Or instead of, no, it's all right. I was going to do it anyway. It was on my way. Right. So I love that.
Right.
Yeah, I wanna echo Kim's comment with regards to Brian bringing up the V word, vulnerability. You know, we're so programmed in our society to be strong. You have to be strong. You have to just plow through it no matter what, because that's what you're supposed to do. No, you're supposed to be human, and you're supposed to just be. And you know, like you said, Kim, without that presence, you can't be vulnerable. And, you know, going back to what I was saying before with regards to safety, if you don't feel safe, you can't be vulnerable. And if you can't be vulnerable, then you can't be present. So it's all a vicious chain.
Yeah.
And without that full chain, then you can't have that momentum that allows you to continuously be vulnerable, continuously feel safe, and continuously being present.
Right. That's interesting, because it could be the vicious chain, or it could be a virtuous cycle, depending on what items we want to incorporate.
Great way to spin it, Nancy.
The vortex of V, right?
Yes. Oh man, I'm glad we brought up that word. You know, actually, so that brings me to this question, because we touched on this a little bit earlier around, if we were to now, let's take this conversation we're having and we'll translate that into the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
Uh-oh.
Right?
Yeah, another 40 minutes.
Bring this down to like, like an application. I'm curious. And to be honest, like, my question's super broad. I mean, and feel free to narrow it down, but I'm curious as to if we were to apply this into the workplace. So let's take it from the leader's position. What would what's the effects? What impact does that have in an organization? And I'm also curious, like, is there examples? Like, if you have examples of it actually working out that way, that's awesome. But yeah, I'm curious, like, how do we translate this into work?
I mean, being in the IT industry for 15 plus years, I've come across a couple of leaders, but most of the leaders that I've come across have not exhibited empathy, compassion, a circle of safety, or created that circle of safety to allow people them to express themselves, them to feel. It was more about getting work done, as opposed to, okay, let's deal with how you're feeling, so this way you can become more productive. And maybe double your output of exactly what it is that you're doing, because you're happy, because you have a place that you feel you can be safe. You wonder why people talk about Mondays as being the dreaded day that you have to go back to work. And it's because of that lack of empathy, that lack of safety, the lack of compassion that these leaders have. Now, if you change that around and you have leaders that exhibit these feelings of empathy, compassion, and a lot of the characteristics that you would see in someone high of EQ, then Mondays is such a great day, because you're looking forward to going to work, a place of safety, a family, if you will, that appreciates who you are and what you do. And no longer do you have to be scared of blame or shame or any of that. And so in the workplace, it actually is a benefit, because it causes people to want to be there. It causes people to be creative and innovative and be excited about coming to work, and knowing that you have somebody who's got your back, and a family or a team that's got your back.
Awesome.
I'm really glad we're talking about the application to work at this point. I was really lucky to have in my parents very diverse models of what happens when somebody has a really great leader and then somebody has an awful leader that doesn't practice those things. So my father was vice president of an insurance company. He practiced positive mental attitude. He practiced gratitude. He grew up through the company with that kind of philosophy, but he was the only leader on the leadership team who practiced it and encouraged and led by having his people who he was working with to also teach them how to cultivate it in them. And they were the #1 region, they were the #1 division for 8 years in a row. Wow. And I think a lot of organizations miss the link between productivity and results and positive mental space and safety and attitude and acceptance. My mother, on the other hand, was part of a corporation where there was a lot of change. The supervisors were crotchety and, task militant and, the waving the finger, that kind of authoritarian approach. And not only did she hate going to the office every single day, her body began to show the impact of that environment. So she developed fibromyalgia, she developed frozen shoulder. It was all this seizing in the body, literally, because there wasn't space for her to be human in her workplace where she was spending most of her time. So having the contrast for me is really valuable, because when we look at how much time people are spending in the workplace and what's the environment, there is a significant impact on people's productivity levels. Like you were saying, Antoni, about, for my dad, Monday was like, yeah, I can't wait. Let's go. Let's see what kind of change we can make. And my mom's like, how many sick days do I have left so I can use them because it's Monday. So it's so important. And I think leaders have missed over the time what that connection is for success on multiple levels.
So
I hope we can bring that humanity back. Right?
Yeah, I love what you're sharing there, Kim, about the environment, right? So what I'm hearing from your examples is like your dad's created the condition for the environment there. And what I've noticed in my experience is there's a lot of thank yous in an environment that's thriving. And while there may be tokens of thank yous like team lunches and stuff when you're working 18-hour days, that's a manifestation of thank you in a way. But how about thank yous for the small stuff, right? Thank yous for going out of your way, encouraging the behaviors you seek to incent and you encourage and want more of. So there's more thank yous. And in my training, we have this tool called an ICU, an acknowledgement. So it's giving, it's recognizing someone, acknowledging someone for something that happened and connecting it to what the impact was. And there's a specific format to it. And so it's helping people see valued, be valued, be seen, and be heard. And it's in the present. And so you try and do it as close to the activity and the so that the person can make the connection. So it's sticky, if you want to call it feedback. And it's something that makes you feel good giving it. And then the intent is to kind of acknowledge something that someone did well and celebrate them for it and what the impact was either on you or on others. And so there's energy around celebrating people, thanking people, instead of sort of like, oh yeah, we pay you. You're supposed to be working 18 hours a day for 4 months because the project needs it. And it's almost like, we become objects instead of people. And there's a good book on that in terms of leadership and self-deception. That's sort of the environment that many of us are familiar with. And I wrote an article and I talk about the work mask a lot. And the work mask talks about your mom's experience, Kim, or in terms of how do I navigate and survive? That's the last piece of clothing invisible clothing we put on before we go into the workplace. And it's about surviving. So are we bringing our best self? Then no, because we're not incented to. We're not treated as human beings. We're not feeling valued, seen, and heard. So we're not inclined to bring discretionary effort, ideas that might spawn ideas from other people that might bring more creative, more innovative, and better solutions. And so I think that creating the conditions and gratitude and behaviors like that demonstrate empathy and a lot of the traits we're talking about are critical to creating better in the workplace.
It's, man, there's so much in this conversation around like application wise. And I think about one of the challenges when I think application to the workplace is, how does this apply when stress is on, right? So when things are pretty normal, we can carry out things and be more open to, hey, I'm going to be more grateful. I'm going to recognize anything. But it's when I think that you mentioned, Kim, about your mom, the situation being like things were constantly changing. So in most work environments right now, that's what's happening, right? Like things are always changing. And that's just the reality of where we're at. And so it brings me back to the importance of starting small on your own, which is where we started this conversation. It creates that muscle that I can recognize it when things are spinning. And as a leader, I can see that then the opportunities for it when I'm with people, when I'm within an organization where that's not happening. So that's where your dad's example shows up, is that I'm assuming, was doing that all the time. He wasn't just doing it when he went to work, and that's just who he was, right? Like that was his practice. And so it just brings me back to who we are. Like that really does show through then and can have significant impact. Because I know sometimes the feeling is, what impact can I doing this as one person? It actually does, right? There's this contagious effect that goes with that. So I'm looking at our time here, and I want to make sure that we have a little bit of time just to wrap up with our conversations, kind of taken us from like the soft to broader to some specific areas around practicing gratitude. As you think about the folks listening into this conversation and maybe looking to join in, what might you leave everybody with as you think through what we've talked about so far?
One of the easy things I think that people can do that I'd really like to leave people with is this concept of catch me being good, or catch me being positive, or catch me being grateful. And when people talk about gratitude, there's ideas around how that's supposed to be done even. And a simple thing is just like we've all been saying, is look for the moments that are worthy of being thankful for. As leaders, look for those moments that you can see your people succeeding and excelling, and start there. So it's a really simple way, because you begin to develop that, and so it can become automatic. And that's one of the things that I'm really working towards, is working with people on an individual level to do that. And I train people in something called activated communication. And the communication is all about, how do you as a listener, what does active listening as a leader really mean? What is that skill? And not only how do you listen, what the heck do you do with it after? Like, what does that mean to you? And what are some actual concrete steps? Because there's a lot of abstract pieces connected with gratitude and leadership in general. What are the specific responses you can make to a person in that moment so you can demonstrate presence, so you can demonstrate that you understand and accept? And so that communication program, I think, is something that I'm offering. I'm super excited about because it gives people that ability to develop the muscle.
That's awesome.
The piece I'd like to give the viewers or the listeners is to take 10 to 15 minutes a day to just listen to yourself. Be present at that moment in time, wherever it is that you are, whether you're at work, at home. Instead of plugging in to Instagram or Facebook or listening to music or listening to a podcast, take the time, 10 to 15 minutes, and really be present with yourself and listen to what you are feeling. And, you know, on a leadership level, it's about doing the same thing. It's about being present with your people, listening to what they have to say in order for you to actually be grateful for what it is that they're doing for you, your team, and your organization.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Love that. And so what you have me thinking about, and I'd like to share with the viewers, is attentiveness. And so attentiveness to what's happening with you, attentiveness to signs either in your body or otherwise of what you may be needing, and realizing that needing doesn't mean needy, it means you're human, and attending to those needs. And gratitude helps you with that, build the muscle of, hey, what's going well in my life right now, looking at what's working as a first look rather than looking at the things that may not, because we can get caught up in the swirl of that and never be able to come out and see all the good. And then attentiveness builds that muscle of attentiveness to itself, also then will build the muscle for you and capability for you to be more attentive with others. And that gets to improving your interpersonal relations as well. So I would leave you all with that.
Wow. Really good stuff. I'm like jotting down everything you're saying as takeaways for myself as well. I think the main thing for me is this, it's probably just circling back to where we started, is the idea of the self, which is what each of you has brought up, is the idea of being able to demonstrate gratitude to somebody else, demonstrate something, starts with how I practice it with myself. And so the practice of it, it's this practice of doing that creates that feeling as well. So it creates that cycle. So the word or the phrase that was popping up in my mind, especially as you were talking, Antoni, was taking a selfie of your soul, right? Like we are really good at like turning that camera to ourselves, but it's like, yeah, do the same thing. Just go inward and yeah, spend a little bit of time there and be present with who's there and how we show up. And that idea of what you said, Brian, around like gratitude helps build that ability to be attentive to that. I love this conversation that we had today, and so grateful for all the amazing thoughts that each of you has brought in. So I want to say thanks, Kim, Antoni, and Brian, for a really rich conversation and lots of takeaways for all of us. And so just for everyone who is joining in, listening into the conversation, that's what this is. It's a conversation. So we're encouraging you. What thoughts do you have? What comments do you have? What are questions that maybe we didn't even think about that you feel needs to be part of the conversation? You can drop a note, message into the comments once we get this posted, and we'll definitely have, if Kim and Antoni are okay with it, we'll have just some ways to get in touch with them as well that we will have available to all of you. So I want to thank you all for being on the call today.
Thank you.
Thanks,
It was
Nancy.
awesome.
Thanks, everyone. Awesome conversation.
Amazing.